In December of 1913, a 71-year-old man wrote a letter that sounded less like a farewell and more like a challenge to history itself. Ambrose Bierce, one of America's most brilliant and merciless writers, announced he was traveling south into Mexico, where a revolution was swallowing cities whole. He knew men vanished there without names, without graves, without witnesses. And yet, he went anyway. His final words were calm, almost satisfied. Then the letters stopped. No body was ever found, no execution confirmed, no grave marked. One of the sharpest minds of his generation walked into the violence of the Mexican Revolution and simply ceased to exist. The question isn't how Ambrose Bierce died. The question is whether he intended to disappear at all. Ambrose Bierce did not write to comfort his readers. He wrote to unsettle them. From the moment his byline began appearing in American newspapers, his voice carried a sharpness that felt almost personal, as if each sentence were aimed directly at the reader's assumptions about morality, patriotism, and meaning. In an era that celebrated progress and optimism, Bierce offered something far colder: the conviction that human nature had not improved at all, and that death remained the only honest conclusion to every story. He built his reputation as a journalist in the rough, unfiltered world of 19th century American newspapers. This was not a profession for the cautious. Columns were battlegrounds, and Bierce treated every topic, politics, religion, social customs, as an enemy position to be exposed and destroyed. His prose was economical and lethal. He did not argue, he condemned. Readers learned quickly that Bierce's columns would not reassure them. They would strip away illusions and leave discomfort behind. This was not bitterness for its own sake. It was the voice of a man who believed truth, when spoken plainly, was inherently cruel. That cruelty reached its purest form in his satire. In the Devil's Dictionary, Bierce compressed entire worldviews into single, devastating definitions. Words society treated as sacred, love, honor, peace, were dissected and found hollow. The humor was dark, but the intent was serious. Bierce was documenting what he saw as the underlying mechanics of human behavior: self-interest masked as virtue, violence disguised as necessity, and sentimentality used to avoid confronting reality. Laughter, in Bierce's hands, became a weapon. Yet it was in fiction that Bierce's preoccupation with death became impossible to ignore. His short stories rarely offered redemption. Instead, they lingered on fear, anticipation, and the precise instant when life collapses into nothingness. His most famous work, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is often remembered for its twist ending, but the twist is not the point. The story forces the reader to inhabit the condemned man's final illusion of escape, stretching mere seconds into an entire imagined lifetime. When the illusion shatters, it does so brutally, without warning or mercy. The rope tightens, the neck snaps, and the story ends, not with meaning, but with silence. This was Bierce's philosophy in narrative form. Death does not arrive politely. It does not wait for understanding or closure. It interrupts. Again and again, Bierce returned to this idea. His characters misinterpret their circumstances. They believe they have time. They believe they are special. And then they die. There is no lesson offered beyond the fact of mortality itself. To Bierce, the universe was indifferent, and pretending otherwise was an act of self-deception. What separates Bierce from other writers of his era is how personally he seemed to engage with this idea. Death was not a metaphor to him. It was a physical presence. His stories are filled with bodies, with fear sweat, with the sensory details of dying. He described executions, battlefield deaths, and psychological terror with a precision that suggested familiarity rather than imagination. Over time, readers began to sense that Bierce was not merely writing about death. He was circling it, studying it, perhaps even rehearsing for it. As he aged, this fascination only intensified. Bierce did not mellow. He did not soften his worldview to fit public expectations of wisdom or nostalgia. If anything, his writing became more stripped down, more fatalistic. Friends and contemporaries described him as increasingly isolated, intellectually sharp, but emotionally distant. He seemed uninterested in legacy, uninterested in comfort, and uninterested in explaining himself. It was as if he had already stepped partially outside the world he continued to describe. By the time Ambrose Bierce approached the final years of his life, his work had established a consistent pattern: sudden endings, vanished men, and realities that collapse without explanation. Long before he disappeared in history, Bierce had been disappearing on the page again and again, leaving his readers alone with unanswered questions. In that sense, his eventual vanishing would not contradict his life's work, it would complete it. Before Ambrose Bierce became known as a writer of ruthless satire and merciless stories, he became something far more permanent, a survivor of a war that never truly released him. The American Civil War did not merely pass through Bierce's life, it embedded itself into his bones, his memory, and his understanding of existence. For him, war was not a chapter that ended in victory or defeat. It was a condition, one that followed him long after the gunfire faded. Bierce enlisted as a young man, full of the same abstract notions of duty and purpose shared by thousands of others. That illusion did not last long. He saw combat early, and what he witnessed stripped away any romantic ideas about warfare. Battles were not clean or heroic. They were chaotic, deafening, and indiscriminate. Men screamed for medics who never arrived. Orders dissolved into confusion. Bodies fell not in noble poses, but in awkward heaps, tangled together in mud and blood. Bierce learned quickly that survival often depended less on courage than on chance. He came close to death more than once. During the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in 1864, Bierce was shot through the head. The bullet entered near his temple and exited through his jaw, a wound that should have killed him instantly. Instead, he lived. The injury left him physically marked and psychologically altered. He would later describe moments like these with unsettling clarity, as if replaying them endlessly in his mind. For Bierce, death had reached out, touched him, and withdrawn at the last second. That proximity would define him. The war exposed Bierce to a constant state of anticipation, the waiting before an attack, the silence before artillery fire, the knowledge that at any moment existence could simply stop. This tension lodged itself deep within him. Unlike those who found meaning in survival, Bierce found only confirmation of randomness. He watched capable men die for no reason, while others lived without explanation. There was no moral accounting, no divine balance. The battlefield taught him that death was not a consequence, it was an event, indifferent and sudden. These experiences would later surface in his fiction with disturbing precision. Bierce wrote about soldiers who never hear the bullet that kills them, about men who realize too late that their fate was sealed long before they understood it. His stories capture the warped sense of time that combat produces, where seconds stretch endlessly and entire lives vanish in an instant. This was not imaginative exaggeration. It was memory, sharpened and repurposed into narrative. Even after the war ended, Bierce could not escape its presence. He carried it with him into civilian life, into journalism, into every line he wrote. The war had dismantled his faith in institutions and ideals. Governments spoke of honor. Bierce remembered mass graves. Politicians celebrated unity. Bierce recalled how easily men were ordered to kill one another. The contrast hardened him. Cynicism for Bierce was not bitterness, it was realism earned under fire. More than anything, the war gave Bierce an intimate familiarity with death. He did not treat it as an abstract end or a poetic symbol. Death to him had weight, smell, and sound. He had seen it arrive without warning and depart without meaning. This is why his later stories do not mourn death or glorify it. They observe it, calmly, clinically, almost conversationally. Death was not an enemy to Bierce. It was a constant presence, a companion that had walked beside him since his youth. As the years passed, that companionship grew quieter but never weaker. Bierce did not seek comfort in nostalgia or reconciliation. He did not soften his recollections or reframe them as necessary sacrifices. He understood that the war had permanently altered his perception of reality. Life was fragile, consciousness was temporary, and endings rarely announced themselves in advance. When Ambrose Bierce would later choose to step into another war decades after surviving his first, those who understood him best were not surprised. The Civil War had already taught him how stories end. It had taught him that disappearance is not an anomaly. It is the natural state of those caught in history's violence. The war never left him, because it had already shown him the truth he would carry to his own vanishing. Ambrose Bierce survived a war that killed hundreds of thousands, but survival did not spare him from loss. In many ways, it only prolonged it. As the decades passed, the people around him disappeared one by one, until Bierce found himself standing almost alone, a relic of an earlier world, carrying grief that never fully settled into memory. The man who had written so precisely about death would come to know it not only on battlefields, but at the dinner table, in family letters, and in the quiet spaces where relationships slowly collapse. Bierce's marriage was troubled almost from the beginning. He and his wife, Molly Day, shared years marked by separation, reconciliation, and growing emotional distance. Their relationship strained under financial instability, Bierce's relentless temperament, and long periods apart caused by his work. Over time, affection gave way to formality, and then to estrangement. By the later years of his life, Bierce lived largely separated from his wife, emotionally and physically. The marriage did not end in dramatic conflict, it simply eroded, leaving behind a sense of detachment that mirrored Bierce's broader withdrawal from personal intimacy. But nothing shaped his later years more profoundly than the deaths of his sons. Bierce had 3 children, and he would outlive 2 of them, losses that struck with a cruelty even he struggled to articulate. His younger son, Day, died of pneumonia at a young age. The death was sudden, mundane, and irreversible. There was no battlefield, no enemy, no narrative of sacrifice. Just illness, decline, and absence. Bierce rarely wrote about this loss directly, but those close to him observed a noticeable hardening afterward, as if something had closed permanently. The greater blow came years later with the death of his elder son, Lee. Unlike his brother, Lee did not die by accident or illness. He died by his own hand. The suicide shattered what remained of Bierce's emotional defenses. He blamed society, circumstance, and perhaps himself, but never publicly expressed grief in conventional terms. Instead, he retreated further into silence and cynicism. Friends noted that after Lee's death, Bierce spoke even more openly about life's futility, about the illusion of purpose, about how endings often arrive without explanation or justice. These losses left Bierce as a man who had outlived not only his family, but his sense of belonging. Many of his contemporaries were gone, literary movements shifted, younger writers admired him but did not truly understand him. He was respected, but increasingly alone. His sharp wit remained intact, but it now carried the weight of personal bereavement. Death was no longer something he observed from a distance. It had entered his home and stayed. Old age did not soften Bierce. It isolated him. He did not seek comfort in companionship or nostalgia. Instead, he cultivated distance, both emotional and philosophical. He lived simply, travelled frequently, and avoided forming deep new attachments. To some, this appeared as bitterness. To others, it seemed deliberate. Bierce had learned that attachment created vulnerability, and vulnerability invited pain. Survival, he believed, required control over one's words, one's actions, and ultimately, one's ending. This belief would become increasingly important as he entered his 70s. Bierce spoke openly about his lack of fear regarding death. He had no interest in prolonged decline, dependency, or fading relevance. He had watched too many men linger meaninglessly. In letters to friends, his tone was calm, almost relieved when discussing mortality. There was no panic, no plea for longevity, only acceptance and perhaps planning. When viewed through this lens, Bierce's eventual disappearance begins to look less like an accident of history and more like a final assertion of autonomy. He had lost his children. He had lost his marriage. He had outlived his peers. What remained was the question of how his own story would end. For a man who despised randomness and sentimentality, allowing death to arrive passively may have felt intolerable. Control, even in disappearance, would be preferable. By the time Ambrose Bierce approached the final chapter of his life, he had already endured the kind of losses that hollow men from the inside. What followed was not despair, but resolution. He had survived long enough to understand that survival itself was not the goal, meaning, if it existed at all, could only be claimed on one's own terms. And so, the man who outlived everyone may have chosen not to linger any longer signals that his own ending would not be decided for him. By the time news of the Mexican Revolution began reaching American newspapers, Ambrose Bierce was already an old man by the standards of his era. He had lived through one civil war, buried 2 sons, and watched the world he understood slowly recede into something louder, faster, and unfamiliar. Yet, when Mexico erupted into violence in 1910, Bierce did not look away. He leaned closer. Where others saw chaos and danger, Bierce recognized something he understood intimately: history tearing itself open and men vanishing into it without explanation. The Mexican Revolution was not a single war, but a rolling collapse of authority, marked by shifting alliances, brutal reprisals, and entire regions slipping beyond control. Newspapers struggled to keep up. Leaders rose and fell in months. Armies formed overnight and dissolved just as quickly. Executions were public. Graves were shallow or non-existent. To Bierce, this was not foreign territory. It was familiar terrain. The disorder echoed the battlefields of his youth, stripped of pretense and honesty, brutal in its simplicity. Among the figures dominating headlines was Pancho Villa, a revolutionary commander who seemed to embody contradiction. Villa was ruthless and charismatic, capable of generosity one moment and mass execution the next. To American readers, he appeared as both bandit and folk hero. To Bierce, he was something else entirely, a living symbol of violent transformation, a man shaped and consumed by war. Bierce read everything he could about Villa, intrigued not by his politics, but by his presence. Villa existed at the center of uncertainty, where survival depended on instinct rather than ideology. Bierce's fascination was not romantic. He did not imagine revolution as noble. He understood its cost. But unlike younger men, he did not fear that cost. He had already paid it. What drew him south was not adventure, but clarity. In Mexico, the rules were stripped away. Death was visible, immediate, and unhidden. For a man who despised hypocrisy and illusion, the revolution offered something brutally honest, a place where endings happened without ceremony. Friends questioned his interest. Some dismissed it as morbid curiosity, others assumed he was simply chasing a final story. But Bierce had never been a war correspondent in the conventional sense. He did not embed himself for prestige or profit. His writing about war was personal, reflective, and uncomfortably intimate. He was not observing from the outside. He was returning to a psychological landscape that had defined him since his 20s. At 71, Bierce was keenly aware of his age. He spoke openly about having little left to lose. His letters carried no anxiety about safety, no concern for longevity. Instead, there was a quiet decisiveness. He did not frame the journey as reckless. He framed it as necessary. Mexico represented unfinished business, not politically but existentially. It was a place where his lifelong understanding of death aligned with reality once more. There was also control in the decision. Bierce had spent decades watching people die slowly, of illness, irrelevance, regret. He rejected that fate. Entering a revolution was dangerous, yes, but danger was honest. It did not pretend to offer comfort. It did not prolong decline. In a war zone, death arrived cleanly or not at all. For Bierce, that was preferable to waiting. Pancho Villa's campaign in particular held symbolic weight. Villa's forces moved constantly, leaving little record behind. Men disappeared into columns of dust and gunfire. Prisoners were executed without trial. Witnesses contradicted one another. History fractured into rumor. Bierce understood that in such an environment, identity dissolved. A man could vanish without paperwork, without ceremony, without explanation. That disappearance would not be corrected later. It would simply become part of the chaos. For a writer who had spent his life exploring sudden endings, This may have felt like a final alignment between philosophy and reality. Bierce did not believe in tidy conclusions. He believed in interruption. The Mexican Revolution offered exactly that, a place where stories stopped mid-sentence, where lives ended without summary. To walk into that world was not irrational, it was consistent. When Bierce finally decided to go, he did so without drama. He did not announce a grand purpose. He did not seek permission or reassurance. He framed the journey as observation, but his tone suggested something deeper. He was not chasing relevance, he was approaching a boundary he had studied all his life. The old man and the revolution were not opposites. They were converging forces, drawn together by a shared indifference to permanence. Ambrose Bierce did not vanish all at once. He faded gradually, step by step, documented in fragments, letters, receipts, eyewitness memories, until the record simply stopped. Chapter 6 is the final stretch where history can still keep pace with him, where his movements remain anchored to paper and testimony. After this point, everything dissolves into rumour. In the autumn of 1913, Bierce travelled south through Texas, moving with purpose but without haste. He wrote letters along the way, not dramatic farewells but measured observations delivered in his familiar, restrained tone. There was no hint of fear, no anxiety about the violence waiting beyond the border. Instead, his words conveyed calm acceptance, even satisfaction, as if the journey itself carried meaning regardless of its outcome. Witnesses later recalled seeing Bierce in Texas towns near the border, an elderly man with sharp eyes, neatly dressed, travelling light. He did not behave like a thrill-seeker or a reckless adventurer. He asked practical questions. He listened more than he spoke. Those who encountered him remarked on his composure. If Bierce felt the weight of his age, he did not show it. If he sensed danger, he accepted it without protest. The border between the United States and Mexico in 1913 was not a clean line. It was a porous threshold defined by rail stations, river crossings, and informal checkpoints. Soldiers moved through it freely. Refugees crossed in both directions. Journalists, mercenaries, and opportunists followed the fighting south. Bierce blended into this current effortlessly. He was neither official nor anonymous. Just another man entering a country consumed by revolution. One of Bierce's final confirmed letters was written from El Paso, Texas. In it, he mentioned his intention to continue onward, deeper into Mexico. His words carried a quiet finality. He did not describe plans for return. He did not outline future projects. Instead, he framed the journey as an ending in itself. To those who later reread the letter, it felt less like correspondence and more like a closing statement. Crossing into Mexico, Bierce travelled by train where tracks still functioned, and by horse or carriage where they did not. Timelines reconstructed from railway schedules and military movements place him moving steadily south, following the same routes used by revolutionaries and foreign observers. He was seen conversing with other travellers, occasionally sharing meals, always attentive, always detached. There is no record of him carrying weapons, no indication he sought protection. He relied on his status as an observer, and perhaps on fate. What makes this stage of Bierce's journey so unsettling is its clarity. There is no confusion here. He did not disappear abruptly or unexpectedly. He crossed the border openly, deliberately, and with awareness of what awaited him. Every mile south reduced the likelihood of retrieval, of rescue, of certainty. Yet Bierce did not deviate. If anything, his movements suggest commitment rather than hesitation. The revolution had disrupted record-keeping across northern Mexico. Towns changed hands weekly. Officials fled or were executed. Trains vanished. Paper trails burned. Bierce was moving into a region where documentation was already collapsing. And still, for a time, his presence could be traced, his name mentioned in conversations, his arrival noted in passing by others moving through the same corridors of chaos. The final confirmed sighting of Ambrose Bierce places him in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. After that moment, history loses its grip. Letters cease. Witnesses contradict one another. Dates blur. What remains are possibilities, not facts. But up to the border, and just beyond it, Bierce is fully present, fully intentional. This is the last chapter where his life follows a straight line. Beyond it, the story fractures. The border crossing is not merely geographic, it is narrative. On one side, there is documentation. On the other, only silence. Ambrose Bierce stepped across that line willingly, carrying with him the understanding that some journeys are not meant to be traced back. By the time Ambrose Bierce reached the city of Chihuahua, he had already passed beyond the reach of ordinary explanation. Chihuahua was not just another stop along his journey south, it was the final place where history could still place him with confidence. After this point, the trail disintegrates. What remains is a city caught in revolution, a handful of testimonies, and the last moment when Bierce's presence could be verified before he slipped into uncertainty. In late 1913, Chihuahua stood at the heart of revolutionary Mexico. Control of the city shifted constantly, depending on which faction had last passed through with rifles and authority. Streets that appeared calm one day could erupt into violence the next. Executions were common. Prisoners disappeared without documentation. For an aging American writer accustomed to clarity and precision, Chihuahua represented the edge of order, a place where records stopped mattering and survival depended on timing and luck. Multiple accounts place Bierce in Chihuahua during this period. He was reportedly seen in hotels and public spaces, observing quietly, asking questions and watching the movement of revolutionary troops. He did not posture as a participant, but neither did he behave like a distant tourist. Witnesses described him as attentive and composed, moving through the city with the calm of someone who understood the risks and had already accepted them. It is here that Bierce is believed to have encountered forces aligned with Pancho Villa. Whether he formally joined Villa's column or merely travelled alongside it remains unclear. The distinction may not matter. In revolutionary Mexico, proximity was often enough to determine fate. Observers, sympathizers, and bystanders were frequently treated the same as combatants. Bierce would have known this. He had seen how war erased nuance. Chihuahua offered Bierce exactly what he had been drawn toward: proximity to violence without pretense. Soldiers marched openly through streets. Gunfire echoed at unpredictable hours. Authority existed only in the moment it could be enforced. This environment mirrored the battlefield conditions Bierce had survived decades earlier: unstable, unsentimental, and indifferent to individual stories. Some accounts suggest Bierce travelled further south from Chihuahua with the revolutionary forces, possibly toward Ojinaga or other contested areas. Others claim he remained in the city longer, observing events as an informal chronicler. No surviving letter confirms either scenario. What is certain is that after Chihuahua, there are no authenticated communications from Bierce. No verified letters, no confirmed sightings supported by multiple sources. The paper trail ends abruptly. This silence is not gradual, it is immediate. Bierce does not fade from the record over months or years. He disappears at once, swallowed by the confusion of war. That abruptness has fueled speculation ever since. Was he executed? Killed in battle? Did he choose the moment to vanish, knowing the chaos would erase the details? Chihuahua is where all theories converge and then diverge. The city itself provides no answers. Records from the period are incomplete or lost. Revolutionary commanders kept inconsistent documentation, if any at all. Bodies were buried hastily or left where they fell. Foreigners who died often went unrecorded, especially those without official status. Bierce, travelling independently and without protection, fit perfectly into the category of men who could vanish without trace. What makes this moment so unsettling is its precision. Bierce did not disappear into legend from the outset. He reached Chihuahua intentionally. He was seen, he was present, and then, without warning, the story stops. There is no confirmed final sentence, no documented final act. For a writer who had spent his life exploring the terror of sudden endings, the symmetry is impossible to ignore. Chihuahua represents the last solid ground beneath Bierce's feet. Beyond it lies only speculation. It is the final place where Ambrose Bierce existed as a man recorded by history rather than a figure claimed by mystery. Whatever happened next, whether violent, deliberate, or accidental, occurred in a space where facts dissolve faster than memory. After Chihuahua, Bierce becomes what he had so often written about, a man whose story ends without explanation, leaving behind only the uneasy certainty that the ending was real, even if the details were lost. One of the oldest and most enduring explanations for Ambrose Bierce's disappearance is also the simplest, that he was captured and executed by revolutionary forces, his life ending not in mystery, but before a firing squad somewhere in northern Mexico. In a land consumed by paranoia, violence, and shifting loyalties, such an ending would have been neither rare nor remarkable. It would have required no conspiracy, no elaborate planning, only the wrong moment, the wrong suspicion, and a foreign face in the wrong place. During the Mexican Revolution, executions were not exceptional events. They were routine instruments of control. Men were killed for carrying the wrong papers, speaking to the wrong people, or simply being present when authority changed hands. Foreigners were especially vulnerable. Journalists, travelers, and observers were often suspected of espionage, particularly when they asked questions or took notes. Bierce, an elderly American with a sharp mind and a habit of observation, would have stood out immediately. The revolutionary environment rewarded decisiveness, not investigation. Commanders rarely paused to confirm identities. If a man appeared suspicious, hesitation could be fatal, for the officer, not the prisoner. Summary executions eliminated risk. In that context, Bierce's age and reputation offered no protection. To a revolutionary soldier, he was not a famous writer. He was a stranger with unknown intentions. Some later accounts claimed Bierce was detained after joining or travelling alongside forces linked to Pancho Villa. Whether accurate or not, proximity alone could have sealed his fate. Revolutionary columns were constantly infiltrated by spies, deserters, and informants. Suspicion was constant. A foreigner observing troop movements, listening carefully, and writing privately could easily be interpreted as a threat. Once suspicion attached itself, outcomes were swift and irreversible. According to this theory, Bierce was taken into custody, questioned briefly, if at all, and executed without formal record. Firing squads were efficient and anonymous. Bodies were buried quickly or left unmarked. Names were not preserved. In many cases, even commanders could not later account for who had been killed and why. Bierce's disappearance fits this pattern perfectly, sudden, undocumented, and absorbed into the larger violence of the revolution. What lends this theory weight is its ordinariness. There is no drama in it, no grand gesture, no symbolic ending, just a man eliminated by a system that did not care who he was. For a writer who believed death was arbitrary and indifferent, this ending would be brutally consistent with his worldview. Yet this explanation leaves behind an unsettling absence. There is no confirmed execution order, no eyewitness testimony that can be traced reliably, no burial site. The silence surrounding Bierce's supposed execution is total. Supporters of the theory argue that this is precisely the point. Revolutionary Mexico swallowed men whole. Documentation was a luxury. Memory was unreliable. Bierce did not vanish because his death was extraordinary. He vanished because it was ordinary. Others question whether Bierce would have resisted or protested. Those who knew him suggest he would not have begged or explained himself. He had no patience for justification. If confronted with armed men demanding answers, Bierce may have offered only silence or irony, responses unlikely to preserve his life. His composure, admirable in peace, may have appeared defiant in war. The firing squad theory also raises a deeper question. Would Bierce have objected to such an ending? He had written extensively about executions, often portraying them as abrupt, unjust, and devoid of meaning. To die in such a manner would not have contradicted his beliefs, it would have confirmed them. Death, arriving without explanation, stripping identity to a body and a moment, that was the reality he had described for decades. Still, there is something incomplete about this explanation. It resolves the mystery too neatly. It provides an ending without evidence, certainty without proof. And Bierce, a man who distrusted simple answers, may have understood that better than anyone. Whether he was executed or not, the absence of confirmation ensures that his death remains suspended, neither fully real nor fully imagined. If Bierce was executed by revolutionaries, then history lost him the same way it lost thousands of others. quickly, quietly, and without apology. The rifles would have fired, the body would have fallen, and the world would have moved on, unaware that one of its sharpest observers had just become another unrecorded casualty of chaos. Another theory offers an ending even more anonymous than execution, that Ambrose Bierce died in the chaos of battle, riding alongside revolutionary forces and disappearing into the violence of a skirmish that history barely recorded. In this version of events, Bierce was not singled out, questioned, or judged. He was simply absorbed into combat, reduced to one more body among thousands, his identity erased by gunfire and confusion. The Mexican Revolution was not fought in neatly defined campaigns. Battles erupted suddenly, often without formal declarations. Columns of men clashed along rail lines, in villages, and across open desert. Engagements lasted minutes or hours, leaving behind scattered casualties and little documentation. Men who fell were buried hastily, if at all. Names vanished, stories blurred. This was the environment Bierce entered knowingly. Some accounts suggest that Bierce travelled with forces aligned with Pancho Villa as they moved through northern Mexico. Whether he formally rode with them or merely followed in proximity remains unclear. The distinction mattered little. Once fighting began, observers became participants by default. There was no safe distance. Bullets did not discriminate between soldier and civilian, veteran and novice, writer and revolutionary. Bierce had lived through this before. During the American Civil War, he had witnessed how men died without warning, sometimes without realizing they were under fire. He had seen bodies disappear into fields that were never revisited. In Mexico, the conditions were even less controlled. Skirmishes erupted in terrain where recovery was impossible and record-keeping irrelevant. If Bierce was present during such a clash, his age would not have protected him. In fact, it may have doomed him. He was not a fast man. He was not conditioned for sudden flight. If gunfire erupted unexpectedly, survival would have depended on instinct and proximity to cover, luxuries Bierce may not have had. A single stray bullet would have been enough. There would have been no moment of recognition, no one to record his final words. After battle, the dead were handled quickly. Revolutionary forces rarely lingered. Bodies were buried in shallow graves or left where they fell. The urgency was always forward motion. The revolution did not pause to identify casualties, especially foreigners. Bierce's remains, if they existed at all, would have been indistinguishable from those around him, dust-covered, anonymous, and forgotten. Supporters of this theory argue that it aligns with Bierce's psychology. He did not seek protection. He did not avoid danger. If he travelled with armed men, he would have accepted the risks without complaint. Dying in battle would not have contradicted his worldview. It would have reinforced it. War did not offer meaning. It offered endings. This theory also explains the complete absence of documentation. No execution order, no arrest record, no witnesses, just silence. A skirmish recorded in military memory but not individual names. Bierce would not have been important enough to note. The revolution consumed thousands. One more casualty would not stand out. There is a particular cruelty in this possibility. Bierce, a man who spent his life recording death with precision, may have died without anyone recording his own. The observer becoming unobserved. The chronicler becoming a statistic that was never even counted. Yet there is also a strange symmetry. Bierce's fiction often placed characters in moments of sudden violence, where fate intervenes without explanation. He wrote about men who never understood what killed them, who vanished into circumstances beyond comprehension. If he died in battle, then his life ended as his stories did, abruptly, without closure, and beyond interpretation. Still, this explanation leaves unanswered questions. No one ever definitively placed Bierce in a specific skirmish. No remains were identified, no personal effects recovered. The theory relies on probability rather than proof. It suggests that in a war defined by erasure, Bierce was erased. If Ambrose Bierce died in battle, then his disappearance was not extraordinary. It was inevitable. He entered a conflict that did not preserve individual narratives. He stepped into a system that reduced men to momentum. His death, if it came this way, would have been instantaneous and final, suggesting that the man who wrote endlessly about sudden endings may have met one himself, unnoticed and unremarked, as history marched on without him. Among all theories surrounding Ambrose Bierce's disappearance, none is more unsettling or more aligned with his character than the idea that he designed his own ending. Not suicide in the conventional sense, but something colder, more deliberate, a controlled surrender to danger, engineered so that death would arrive without decay, humiliation, or prolonged decline. If true, Bierce did not stumble into oblivion. He walked toward it with intention. By the time he traveled to Mexico, Bierce had spoken often and openly about death. His letters reveal a man unafraid of it, even impatient with the idea of lingering. He expressed disdain for old age when it meant weakness, dependency, or irrelevance. To Bierce, dying slowly was a form of indignity. He had watched too many men fade into irrelevance or suffer meaninglessly at the end of their lives. He wanted no part of that future. His writings reinforced this mindset. Again and again, Bierce treated death not as a tragedy but as a release from illusion. His characters rarely fear it. Instead, they misunderstand it, until it arrives. In his worldview, the cruelty of death lies not in its finality, but in humanity's refusal to accept it honestly. Designing one's own ending, therefore, would not be cowardice, it would be clarity. Entering revolutionary Mexico offered Bierce the perfect mechanism. The violence was real, immediate, and impersonal. It allowed death to occur without spectacle, explanation, or moral framing. He would not need to write a note or stage a dramatic act. He could simply place himself in a situation where survival was uncertain and accept the outcome. If he lived, he lived. If he died, the ending would be swift and absolute. This interpretation casts his journey in a new light. Bierce did not carry weapons. He did not seek protection. He traveled alone. His final letters lack future plans. There is no anticipation of return, no hint of projects left unfinished. His tone is composed, even serene. To some it reads as resignation, to others as resolve. Supporters of this theory argue that Bierce understood how Mexico would erase him. He had studied war long enough to know that records disappear, bodies go unnamed, and deaths remain unconfirmed. By choosing such a setting, he ensured that his ending would resist certainty. That ambiguity itself may have appealed to him. Bierce distrusted neat conclusions. A vanishing rather than a documented death would be the ultimate rejection of narrative closure. There is also the question of control. Bierce had lost much of it in his personal life. His sons were gone, his marriage had dissolved, his contemporaries were dying, his influence, while still respected, belonged to an earlier era. Designing his own exit may have felt like reclaiming authorship over the one story that still mattered, his own. Critics of this theory argue that it romanticizes despair, but Bierce was not a romantic. He despised sentimentality. If he orchestrated his own death, it was not for drama or attention. It was for efficiency, for consistency, for truth as he understood it. He did not believe life owed him a happy ending. He believed it owed him nothing at all. There is no direct proof that Bierce intended to die in Mexico. No confession, no final declaration. But there is alignment. His philosophy, his writings, his age, his losses, and his choices all point in the same direction. He went where death was common, accepted and unremarkable. He did not resist the possibility, he embraced it. If Ambrose Bierce designed his own ending, then his disappearance was not a failure of history. It was a success of intention. He achieved what few manage, an ending on his own terms, free from explanation, free from pity, and immune to correction. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was the final expression of a man who believed that meaning collapses the moment we try to impose it. In that sense, Bierce may not have vanished at all. He may have simply stopped participating. Beyond execution, battle, or self-determined disappearance lies a darker and more unsettling possibility, that Ambrose Bierce was deliberately silenced. Not by accident, not by chaos, but by design. The assassination theory suggests that Bierce knew or saw something dangerous, and that his death was not incidental to the Mexican Revolution, but entangled with its hidden machinery of power, intelligence, and propaganda. By 1913, Mexico had become a chessboard for international interests. The United States monitored the revolution closely. Foreign governments, arms dealers, industrialists, and intelligence operatives moved through the region, shaping outcomes from the shadows. Information was currency. Control of narratives mattered almost as much as control of territory. Journalists, especially foreign ones, occupied a dangerous position. They were witnesses capable of shaping public opinion beyond the battlefield. Ambrose Bierce was not an ordinary journalist. He had decades of experience dissecting power, exposing hypocrisy, and writing with a precision that unsettled those in authority. He was politically aware, skeptical of institutions, and unafraid of offending powerful figures. If Bierce observed sensitive movements, negotiations, or betrayals during the revolution, his presence could have been perceived as a liability. Some proponents of the assassination theory argue that Bierce's age made him appear harmless, but that assumption may have been misleading. An older observer carried credibility. His words would be trusted. His accounts, if published, could influence public perception of revolutionary leaders or foreign involvement. Silencing him would have been efficient, especially in a region where disappearances raised little alarm. There are rumours, never substantiated, that Bierce encountered high-level revolutionary figures beyond Villa, or witnessed executions meant to remain unofficial. Others speculate he crossed paths with foreign agents embedded among revolutionary forces, gathering intelligence under the guise of journalism. In such an environment, lines blurred quickly. A man asking questions could easily be interpreted as a spy, or worse, a truth-teller. What gives this theory its unsettling edge is how clean Bierce's disappearance was. There was no body displayed as warning, no public accusation, no announcement. If he was killed deliberately, it was done quietly, efficiently, and without trace. That method aligns with intelligence work rather than revolutionary spectacle. However, the evidence is thin. There are no documents linking Bierce to intelligence services, no intercepted correspondence, no witnesses willing to confirm such an event. The assassination theory survives not because it is proven, but because it is plausible. The conditions allowed for it. The silence afterward supports it. And Bierce himself fits the profile of a man whose voice could be inconvenient. There is also the question of motive. Bierce had little interest in shaping political outcomes. He was an observer, not an activist. Yet observers can be dangerous precisely because they refuse allegiance. A man who writes honestly threatens all sides equally. In revolutions, neutrality is often the most unforgivable position. Skeptics argue that this theory overestimates Bierce's importance. By 1913, he was no longer a central figure in American journalism. His fame had dimmed. Why risk attention to silence an aging writer? Supporters counter that revolutions are paranoid environments. Risk is perceived, not calculated, and elimination is easier than restraint. The assassination theory remains compelling because it resists closure. It suggests that Bierce's disappearance was not philosophical or accidental, but political, that his final act was not to vanish but to be erased. If true, then Bierce did not step willingly into oblivion. He was pushed. Yet without proof, the theory remains suspended, another fragment among many. Like the revolution itself, it leaves behind only echoes, rumours passed through generations, possibilities without confirmation. Bierce's fate, under this interpretation, becomes part of the unseen violence that accompanies every great upheaval, the deaths that serve power but leave no record. If Ambrose Bierce was assassinated, then his disappearance was not a mystery of fate but of intent, a reminder that history does not always erase people by accident. Sometimes it does so deliberately. Among all explanations for Ambrose Bierce's disappearance, none is more controversial or more tantalizing than the idea that he survived and simply walked away, not into death, but into obscurity. This theory suggests that Bierce did not die in Mexico at all. Instead, he used the chaos of revolution as cover to erase himself, shedding his identity and living out his remaining years beyond the reach of history. At first glance, the idea seems implausible. Bierce was elderly, recognizable, and famously sharp-tongued. Reinvention at 71 would appear unrealistic. Yet those who entertain this theory point out that Bierce had always been an expert in disappearance, at least on the page. His stories often feature characters who escape not through heroism, but through misdirection, ambiguity, and the failure of others to notice what matters. Mexico during the Revolution offered ideal conditions for such an erasure. Records were inconsistent, borders were porous, entire communities relocated or vanished, foreigners moved freely between factions, towns, and identities. Names were rarely verified. A man could simply stop using one and begin answering to another. For someone intent on vanishing, few environments were more forgiving. Supporters of this theory argue that Bierce had the temperament for such an act. He valued independence above recognition. He had little attachment to possessions, reputation, or social standing in his later years. His correspondence shows no concern for legacy. He did not preserve his own papers carefully. He distrusted institutions that catalogued and classified human lives. Walking away from his own identity would have been consistent with his disdain for imposed meaning. There are rumors, unverified and often contradictory, of elderly Americans living quietly in remote Mexican villages in the years following Bierce's disappearance. Some accounts describe a reclusive foreigner with a sharp wit, fluent in English, uninterested in his past. None can be confirmed. None provide names. But the persistence of these stories has kept the theory alive. This explanation reframes Bierce's final journey not as an ending, but as an exit. He did not seek death. He sought freedom from narrative. By disappearing without explanation, he denied historians the satisfaction of resolution. He turned his own life into one of his stories, unfinished, unsettling, and immune to interpretation. Critics of this theory argue that it requires too many assumptions, that Bierce would need resources, health, and assistance to survive, that someone as intellectually restless as Bierce would not tolerate a quiet, anonymous existence. Yet those assumptions may misunderstand him. Bierce did not crave attention, he craved honesty. And anonymity, stripped of expectation, may have offered exactly that. There is also the possibility that Bierce did not plan to disappear permanently, but adapted when opportunity presented itself. A missed train, a false report of death, a convenient misunderstanding. In a land where rumors traveled faster than facts, disappearance could happen organically. Bierce may have simply chosen not to correct it. If this theory is true, then Bierce achieved something extraordinary. He escaped history entirely, not as a martyr, not as a victim, but as a man who chose silence over explanation. The absence of proof becomes part of the design. To confirm survival would defeat the purpose. Ultimately, the theory endures because it aligns with Bierce's deepest instincts. He believed identity was fragile, that meaning was imposed, not inherent, that stories were lies we told to make chaos tolerable. Walking away from his own story would have been the ultimate act of authorship. Whether true or not, the idea that Ambrose Bierce survived forces an uncomfortable conclusion, that history does not always claim the final word. Sometimes people simply refuse to leave one behind. Long before Ambrose Bierce disappeared from history, he rehearsed disappearance in his writing. Again and again, his stories return to the same unsettling ideas: sudden endings, mistaken perceptions, lives that conclude without witnesses, and truths revealed only after it is too late to matter. To some scholars, this repetition is not coincidence, it is preparation. Bierce was not merely writing fiction, he was articulating a philosophy of how lives end and how meaning collapses at the moment of death. His most famous story, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, remains the clearest example. The condemned man believes he escapes execution, experiences an entire imagined future, and only in the final sentence does the truth snap into place. Time elongates, reality fractures, hope becomes illusion. The reader is left stunned by the abruptness of the ending. For Bierce, this was not just a narrative trick, it was a statement. Human consciousness invents meaning even as death is already inevitable. The ending always arrives first. This pattern repeats throughout his work. Characters often misunderstand their circumstances, misjudge their safety, or cling to beliefs that collapse instantly. Bierce rarely allows them final words. He denies closure. The moment of death is swift, impersonal, and frequently unseen. In several stories, bodies are never recovered, identities dissolve. The event matters less than the absence it creates. In his essays and journalism, Bierce reinforced these ideas explicitly. He wrote dismissively of legacy, reputation, and posthumous interpretation. He mocked the idea that life's value could be measured by remembrance. In the Devil's Dictionary, he defined fate, destiny, and meaning with deliberate cruelty, stripping them of comfort. To Bierce, belief in significance was a coping mechanism, not a truth. Some passages feel almost prophetic. Bierce wrote about men who walk knowingly toward danger, not out of recklessness, but out of clarity. He explored the notion that the only freedom left to an aging man is the choice of how not to continue. These are not cries for help. They are controlled, analytical reflections. Death, in Bierce's writing, is not feared. It is respected. There is also his fascination with ambiguity. Bierce distrusted explanations. He believed that certainty was often a lie imposed after the fact. In this way, a disappearance, rather than a documented death, would represent the purest expression of his worldview. No ending could be imposed. No narrative could claim authority. Silence would remain undefeated. Some have searched his final letters and essays for hidden messages, coded intent, or deliberate foreshadowing. While no explicit confession exists, the absence itself is telling. Bierce was a precise writer. If he wanted to leave a clear explanation, he would have. That he did not suggest intention rather than oversight. His silence may be the message. Even Bierce's treatment of authorship hints at this. He often mocked writers who sought immortality through work. He understood that texts outlive their creators, but he did not believe that survival equaled meaning. To vanish without explanation would undermine the entire machinery of interpretation. Critics, historians, and readers would be left circling absence rather than resolution. In this light, Bierce's disappearance begins to resemble one of his own stories. The protagonist enters a dangerous landscape. The narrative follows him closely, until it doesn't. The ending is withheld. The reader is forced to confront uncertainty without guidance. The discomfort is the point. Whether Bierce intended his fate to mirror his fiction is impossible to prove, but the alignment is undeniable. His work did not predict a specific outcome, execution, battle, or survival. It predicted ambiguity. It predicted erasure. It predicted an ending that refuses to settle. If Bierce left clues, they were not puzzles to be solved. They were warnings about the futility of solving them. His writing suggests that the need for explanation is itself the illusion. The truth, if it exists, does not announce itself. It simply happens, or disappears. In the end, Bierce may have written his final story not in ink but in absence. A narrative without a conclusion. A life that ends the way his stories always did. Abruptly, unsentimentally, and beyond interpretation. One of the most haunting aspects of Ambrose Bierce's disappearance is not how he may have died, but how completely he vanished. No body was ever recovered, no grave identified, no personal effects returned. For more than a century, the absence of physical evidence has fueled speculation, doubt, and myth. Yet when examined within the historical reality of the Mexican Revolution, this absence becomes less mysterious and far more unsettling. Revolutionary Mexico was not a place that preserved bodies or stories, it was a place that erased them. Between 1910 and 1920, hundreds of thousands died in battles, executions, reprisals, and forced marches. Entire towns were abandoned or destroyed. Records were burned, lost, or never created. In many regions, death occurred faster than documentation could follow. Identification was a luxury reserved for peacetime. Bodies were rarely transported or catalogued. The dead were buried where they fell, if they were buried at all. Shallow graves marked with stones or wooden crosses quickly disappeared under wind and weather. In contested areas, even these markers were removed or ignored as control shifted between factions. Mass graves were common, their occupants unnamed and uncounted. Foreigners fared no better. In fact, they often fared worse. Without local family, official status, or institutional protection, foreign casualties slipped easily into anonymity. If an American died without papers, witnesses, or affiliation, there was no mechanism to ensure their death was recorded. Embassies struggled to track citizens moving through war zones. Communication was slow, unreliable, and often interrupted entirely. Bierce entered this environment alone. He carried no official credentials as a correspondent. He travelled independently, relying on observation rather than affiliation. This made him invisible to bureaucracy even before it collapsed. Once he disappeared, there was no authority responsible for finding him. No army claimed him. No government pursued his remains. Even if Bierce had been executed or killed in battle, recovery would have been unlikely. Revolutionary forces moved constantly. They did not return to burial sites. They did not maintain rosters of the dead. Survival depended on speed, not memory. The dead slowed progress. They were left behind. There is also the question of time. Any attempt to locate Bierce's remains would have occurred weeks or months after his disappearance, far too late in a harsh environment. Northern Mexico's climate, wildlife, and terrain erase traces quickly. Shallow graves collapse, bodies decompose rapidly. Identifying remains without dental records, photographs, or modern forensic methods would have been nearly impossible. Some have suggested that Bierce's body was found, but never identified. This is not unlikely. Countless remains from the Revolution were discovered without names, buried again without record. A solitary elderly man killed in conflict would not stand out among thousands of similar casualties. His identity would have died with him. Others argue that the absence of a body implies survival. But history offers countless examples of confirmed deaths without recovered remains. The lack of a body does not suggest escape. It suggests a system incapable of preservation. Bierce vanished not because he was exceptional, but because the revolution made disappearance routine. This bureaucratic collapse extended beyond burial. Death certificates were rarely issued. Local authorities changed constantly. Records, when they existed, were destroyed during fighting. Even today, historians struggle to reconstruct casualty figures from the Mexican Revolution. Individual deaths were not tracked. They were absorbed. In this context, Bierce's disappearance becomes less enigmatic and more emblematic. He did not vanish because history failed him. He vanished because history was failing everyone. And yet, the absence of a body carries symbolic weight. Bierce spent his life writing about men who disappeared without explanation, characters who died off stage, stories that ended without confirmation. In losing his body to history, Bierce himself became one of those figures, a presence defined by absence. The lack of remains denies closure. It denies certainty. It ensures that every theory remains plausible and none definitive. Whether Bierce was executed, killed in battle, orchestrated his own death, or walked away, the missing body guarantees that the truth cannot be fixed in place. This is not a failure of investigation. It is the natural consequence of chaos. The Mexican Revolution created conditions where disappearance was not extraordinary. It was expected. Bierce stepped into that world fully aware of what it erased. When he vanished, he did so completely, leaving behind no physical anchor for history to hold. In the end, the missing body may be the most honest evidence of all. It tells us that Ambrose Bierce entered a place where identities dissolve. When Ambrose Bierce disappeared, the world did not immediately realize what it had lost. There were no headlines announcing his death, no funeral notices, no official confirmations. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence, something far more powerful began to grow. Bierce did not simply fade from life, he transformed into a legend, his absence becoming the most enduring chapter of his story. At first, the uncertainty was treated as a temporary inconvenience. Friends assumed letters would arrive. Editors expected reports. Weeks passed, then months. Gradually, concern gave way to speculation. Without a body or official account, Bierce existed in a liminal state, neither alive nor dead. That ambiguity captured the public imagination in a way a confirmed death never could. Writers, historians, and readers began to circle the mystery. Each theory added a new layer: execution, battle, suicide, survival, assassination. Every explanation reflected as much about the storyteller as about Bierce himself. His disappearance became a canvas onto which fears, philosophies, and obsessions were projected. The man who had dissected illusion now became one. Literary culture embraced the uncertainty. Bierce's works were reread through the lens of his Vanishing. Passages once interpreted as cynical commentary now seemed prophetic. His fixation on sudden endings, unseen deaths, and narrative collapse felt intentional, as if his life had been written to mirror his fiction. Scholars debated whether Bierce had engineered the perfect ending, or whether history had inadvertently given him one. Over time, the mystery eclipsed the man. Bierce's sharp wit, his journalism, his satire, all were filtered through the question of how he disappeared. He became less a historical figure and more a symbol. To some, he represented defiance, a man who refused to be claimed by age, decline, or explanation. To others, he embodied the cruelty of history, which erases even its keenest observers without apology. The absence of closure ensured that Bierce remained relevant. Every generation rediscovered him, not just for his writing, but for the unanswered question he left behind. New archives were searched, old rumors revived, yet no discovery ever settled the matter. The legend survived because it resisted resolution. In this way, Bierce achieved something few writers do. He escaped the finality that time imposes. Most lives end in footnotes. Bierce's ended in a question mark. His disappearance turned him into a perpetual presence, invoked whenever discussions turned to lost authors, unsolved mysteries, or the thin boundary between life and narrative. Popular culture reinforced the myth. Bierce appeared in novels, films, and speculative histories, each imagining a different ending. Some portrayed him as a doomed observer, others as a mastermind of his own erasure. Each retelling kept him alive, not as a man, but as an idea. The mystery became self-sustaining. Ironically, this immortality aligns perfectly with Bierce's own skepticism. He did not believe in legacy as virtue. Yet, by refusing to resolve his own ending, whether intentionally or not, he ensured that interpretation would never stop. The need to explain him keeps him present. Today, Ambrose Bierce is remembered not only for what he wrote, but for what he left unfinished. His disappearance challenges the assumption that history must always conclude neatly. It reminds us that some stories endure precisely because they resist ending. The legend of Bierce refuses to die because it mirrors a deeper truth, that absence can be more powerful than presence, and silence louder than explanation. In Vanishing, Bierce became exactly what he had spent his life describing, a man whose story ends not with certainty, but with unease. In the end, Ambrose Bierce left behind no final sentence, only silence, no confirmed death, no grave, no explanation that history could seal and file away. For a man who spent his life dismantling illusions and mocking humanity's need for meaning, this absence may be the most honest ending imaginable. Bierce did not give the world closure because he did not believe closure was real. Every theory surrounding his disappearance attempts to impose order on chaos. Execution offers justice. Death in battle offers randomness. Suicide by design offers control. Survival offers defiance. Assassination offers conspiracy. Each explanation comforts in its own way, providing a narrative shape to something fundamentally unshaped. Bierce understood this instinct well. He spent decades exposing it, and then he denied it. If Bierce was executed, his life ended as so many did during the Revolution, swiftly, anonymously, without meaning. If he died in battle, he became one more uncounted casualty, erased by momentum. If he orchestrated his own death, he authored the final act with cold precision. If he walked away, he rejected history entirely. And if he was silenced, then history itself became complicit in his erasure. Each possibility reveals something unsettling, not about Bierce, but about our need to know. What makes his disappearance linger is not the lack of evidence, but the way it aligns with everything he believed. Bierce distrusted sentimentality. He rejected comforting lies. He believed that death interrupts rather than concludes, that stories do not end when we want them to. That meaning is something we invent after the fact, not something guaranteed. In that sense, Bierce may have written his perfect ending after all, not with words, but with absence. A life that ends without explanation resists ownership. No historian can finalize it, no biographer can close it. The story remains open, unstable, alive. Perhaps that is the point. Bierce did not want to be remembered as a moral lesson or a tragic figure. He wanted truth, stripped bare. And the truth may be this: some lives do not resolve, some questions are not answered, some endings refuse to arrive. More than a century later, Ambrose Bierce still walks just beyond the edge of certainty. Every generation returns to the same question: what happened to him? And every generation leaves with a different answer. The mystery survives not because it can be solved, but because it cannot. So now the question passes to you. Was Bierce executed by revolutionaries, swallowed by war, or did he choose his own disappearance? Did he die, or did he simply stop participating? There is no correct answer, only the one you find most honest. And as long as that question is asked, Ambrose Bierce has not truly vanished. If you believe history hides more than it reveals, subscribe for more untold stories. Like this video if the mystery unsettled you. And comment below with the theory you believe, because the mystery of Ambrose Bierce only survives as long as people keep questioning it.